I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing, and there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel unto the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Techia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. All right, folks. Well, welcome back. Welcome back. We're going to get to in some ways, the high watermark of the Kabbalah tonight. I say the high watermark because Itzhak Luria's formulation of Kabbalah has basically become Jewish theology. And that's something I think that, you can't really shake a stick at that. It's a really incredible thing that fundamentally one guy, in many ways, formulated how Jews all over the world understand their God, understand their scriptures, understand the world that they live in. And it's like Luria's version of the Kabbalah is so deeply embedded in Judaism that phrases like Tikkun Olam, a phrase that I bet everybody in this class has heard a dozen times. Shuls have Tikkun Olam committees. This idea comes directly from Itzhak Luria. So many ideas that are commonplaces in Judaism really emerge from Itzhak Luria. And so tonight we'll get to his ideas. Now, we're not going to exhaustively deal with his ideas for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that most of his books aren't even translated into English. The vast majority are not translated into English. And even the books that remain in Hebrew are so technical and so difficult that that I have to admit, often can read pages of these books and still not know quite what in the world's going on. These books are very, very difficult. And part of how Itzhak Luria's Kabbalah developed was people trying to make sense of what in the world he was talking about. And so part of what happens is that the books are very complicated, and that the complicatedness, it has its own life. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as we get to Itzhak Luria. But to rewind a little bit and talk about this period that I sometimes refer to as the Inner Regnum, that's the period after the composition of the Zohar, but before the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah. What we have is that in that period, Kabbalah didn't really spread very quickly. It was a very underground, it was a very elite, it was a very hush-hush kind of thing. That's not to say that people weren't publishing things and talking about Kabbalistic ideas, but there was no desire to make it public. It was a very hush-hush, elite, esoteric practice, very much so. And by 1492, with the Alhambra Decree, which declared that basically all Muslims and Jews had to leave Spain or convert, you have the Kabbalah transforming from being a very elite, very inner, very inward-looking, very um, secretive kind of thing, to the Kabbalah actually becoming imbued with a very eschatological, that's to say it has to do with the end of the world, and very messianic leanings. And so in the aftermath of the disaster that was 1492, Kabbalah is going to branch out into the world, and it's going to become popularized. And many of the refugees who fled from Spain, who were actually saved by a Muslim leader, which I don't know why that doesn't get more press, but it should. Bayezid II was the Muslim leader of the Ottoman Empire that basically sent his entire fleet to Spain and saved as many Jews as he could. He, not because he was a great guy or anything, he may have been that too, but he realized that you kick all your doctors, lawyers, and scientists out of a country. Of course, he wanted them, and he was right to do it. The Ottoman Empire saw a huge boom from the importation of the refugees after the 1492 Alhambra decree. By the way, you can also notice that Spain didn't do terribly good in many ways in the aftermath of that either. So many of these Jews are going to settle in the Ottoman Empire. One of the main places they're going to settle is going to be in Salonika. Salonika and Warsaw have been traditionally known as the only two Jewish cities in the world. And so Salonika in Greece is going to be one of the places they're going to settle. But many of the Kabbalistically inclined people are actually going to move to the place that they're most familiar with, at least in their sort of imaginary landscape. And that's up in the Galilee at a place called Sfat near Meron, where Shimon Bar Yochai is the traditional author of the Zohar, was thought to be buried. And it's there at Meron at Sfat or Safed where new forms of Kabbalah begin to emerge. Kabbalah begins to be popularized. This is a very important moment in the history of Kabbalah. They begin to teach it publicly at some level. There are classes you can take on Kabbalah. And what ends up happening is in this area, there is a rise of a new form of Kabbalah that is highly systematized, highly intellectualized, very encyclopedic, and very synthetic, which is just to say that it's organizing all kinds of Kabbalistic ideas into something like a Kabbalistic system. That system, of course, the major one is going to be Joseph Cordovero. We'll talk about him in just a moment. Of course, other forms of Kabbalah also existed at this time. We talked at length last time about Abraham Abulafia and his so-called ecstatic or prophetic Kabbalah. This is a completely other form of Kabbalah that doesn't really care much about the Sfirot and that kind of stuff. He knows about them and he's aware of them and he's interested in them, but that's not part and parcel of his project. His project is a kind of intellectual communion with the divine, and that's accomplished by a wide range of things like breathing techniques and focusing in on Hebrew combinations of Hebrew words and various kinds of mantra-like structures. So there are other forms of Kabbalah that came about in the milieu of the Zohar that didn't quite make it. Now, what's going to be really important is that in the Safed milieu, in the Safedian form of Kabbalah, Isaac Luria and his student Chaim Vital are going to reincorporate some of Abulafia's ideas, and that's going to basically save Abulafia from oblivion. Remember, he had gotten basically excommunicated and exiled to a tiny island, I think near Corsica, and he kind of vanishes from history, probably dies. He's going to be kind of resurrected in many ways by Lurianic Kabbalah. And as I mentioned, this is the area in Safed where Kabbalah is being systematized and it's being popularized. I cannot stress that enough. Kabbalah is being taught in public. Why? Because they think the world's about to end. They think that the 1492 Alhambra decree was the beginning of the end, and that Kabbalah, the unveiling of Kabbalah to the world, would ultimately lead to a kind of eschatological and end of the world event. And that end of the world event would be led at some level by Kabbalistic speculation, and it would urge in the Messiah. And in fact, there were many people at that time, Cordovero being one, Chaim Vital being another one, Itzhak Luria being another, that many people, including those people themselves, thought that they were the Messiah. Chaim Vital, we actually have some of his notes, his autobiographical sketches, like journals, diaries. He even says in his notes that, if I just studied the Mishnah a little longer, I would have become the Messiah. I know it. So these guys are really convinced that the Messiah is not just around the corner, but they might be it. And that kind of idea that you might be the Messiah and you might be ushering in the Messianic age is going to be hugely important as we get to next time when we get to Shabbatai Tzvi and his mystical heresy that leads many, many people to believing that he's the Messiah. So Shabbatai Tzvi is next week. Get to him next time. So as I said, this is the time period where Kabbalah is being popularized. This is a time period where Kabbalah is being opened up to the masses at some level. Not say the masses is being opened up to really elite dudes. It's not really opened up to everybody. And there are new services invented, Kabbalat Shabbat, which is almost certainly the most popular Jewish service that exists today. If you've ever been to a Jewish service, you've probably been to a Friday night Kabbalat Shabbat service. That service is developed at this time, and Shlomo Alkabetz writes the centerpiece of that text, that prayer service, Lecha Dodi, come my beloved, come my bride. And that text, Lecha Dodi, is a classic now among basically all Jews everywhere. And so that was being written by Shlomo Alkabetz. Also, it's worth pointing out that not only are these guys studying together, they're marrying each other's sisters and stuff. Joseph Cordovero married Shlomo Alkabetz's daughter. So Cordovero, or Alkabetz, was Cordovero's father-in-law. So you have all kinds of, this is not just sort of a intellectual thing. They're like kind of in bed with each other. And so this is a very tight-knit world. And I can only imagine some of the Kabbalistic drama that must have precipitated in those circles. I would have loved to have seen the Kabbalistic drama, but unfortunately, a lot of that doesn't survive. If you just want a rough idea about what some of these texts look like. So this is Pardes Romim. This is the main text of Joseph Cordovero. This is a central text of the Cordoveroan system of Kabbalah. If you want a rough idea about how dense it is, it's about that long. Right, so it's a substantial text. This doesn't have any commentary, by the way. It's just a straight text. And if you want to get a sense of what this looks like inside, it's pretty dense, wall-to-wall text, right? If you want to get a sense of what this looks like. So these texts are no joke. Pardes Romim is an incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging text to try to read. There is no translation of this into English at all. I don't think there's no systematic translation for sure. And these texts, many of these foundational texts of Kabbalah still do not have English translations, which is kind of mind-blowing considering how popular at least some version of Kabbalah is. And many of the foundational texts aren't available in English. Even finding copies in Hebrew can be challenging. So this one is an example of the early systematization of the Sefer Zohar to be found in Cordovero. And again, trying to find, and these texts are super difficult, and finding English translations, they just don't exist. They just straightforwardly don't exist. So studying Kabbalah in the original languages is basically what you have to do if you're going to get really deep into Kabbalah. The main texts remain fundamentally in Hebrew. We'll talk about some other texts later as well. So beginning in the 15th century, not only are Jews interested in Kabbalah, but Christians are too. This is a strange turn of events, but it's pretty important in the development of Western Christian spirituality, and especially esoteric spirituality. As you, I'm sure, know, by the 15th century, there was a movement in Italy that we call the Renaissance or whatever. But what we have is the arrival of a great deal of new texts that are being imported from Greece. I say new; they're actually really old texts, but they're being imported into Italy. And what ends up happening is that many of these old texts, they are underwriting an idea that's going on, that in order to get sort of a pure intellectual reality or a pure intellectual appreciation of what's going on in the world, we need to go back in time and look at the original text, or look at the original foundations of this literature. This is sometimes called the Ad Fontes revival, the To the Sources revival. And what you get is a massive translation project led by people like Marsilio Ficino, who are translating for the first time the entire works, for instance, of Plato. Most Christians in the Middle Ages had basically never read Plato. They had fragments of things. They had the Timaeus, and they have other documents, but most pieces of Plato had never been read by a medieval Christian. They just didn't exist. And so you have an enormous influx of new, old ideas coming in from Greece in the 15th century. And there was an idea that was current at the time that primordial wisdom was somehow more reliable than what was going on in the Middle Ages. In fact, it's the Renaissance humanists that are going to refer to that time period before them as Gothic. The Goths, of course, were the people that destroyed the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, and the humanists really hated these people. They thought they were backwards and superstitious, and that their writing was incomprehensible, etc. And so there was a long idea by the Renaissance humanists that the Middle Ages basically was a mistake. All of the scholasticism, all of it was a mistake. And so what we need to do is go back to the original Latin and Greek writers and learn from the original sources, not through a bunch of commentaries and commentaries and commentaries. You cut all that out and you go back and you read just the original sources. And so this Ad Fontes approach also included a great deal of what's going on in Jewish writing as well, because Christians believed that fundamentally Christianity had emerged from Judaism and that there was primordial wisdom to be had by the Jews, and that primordial wisdom captured things that perhaps Christianity had not quite covered. And so Kabbalah fit that bill because that's exactly what Kabbalah claims to be. It claims to be primordial wisdom given to Moses at some level, and then transmitted to Shimon Bar Yochai eventually, and eventually transferred into the Sefer Zohar. And so the idea is that the Kabbalah was one form of this primordial wisdom, along with Zoroastrianism and Plato and Hermes Trismegistus and these sort of figures. And so there was an idea that Kabbalah had secrets that had been preserved by the Jews, but the Jews had preserved them, but they didn't understand them because, of course, the Jews are backwards, blind people who reject the Messiah and don't understand anything. And so the idea was the Jews had all this Kabbalah, but the Jews really didn't understand it. And so these Christians really begin to turn their attention to the Kabbalah, and they begin to recruit non-Jews, that is to say, Jews, former Jews, Jews have converted to Christianity, are Jews who are kind of amenable to this sort of humanistic project. And so we have converted Jews, converso folks like Rhesius and Flavius Mithridates. And we also have just Jews who are just kind of cool with learning together, folks like Yochanan Alamelo. And what ends up happening is that many of the texts of Kabbalah slowly begin to be translated from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin. And as those texts begin to get translated into Latin, Christians begin to see that, one, there's something really, really interesting and really captivating about the Kabbalah, and two, they begin to believe that the Kabbalah actually proves the truth of Christianity. And so they use it not just as a way of accessing primordial wisdom, but also part of what is sometimes referred to as the Latin polemical tradition, where Jewish texts are marshaled against Jews in the interest of converting them. And so the Kabbalah is actually mined for all kinds of Trinitarian ideas. The first three Sefirot are actually the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and all kinds of other ideas where the basic structure is that underneath the hood of Kabbalah is actually a kind of mystical Christianity. The Jews just can't see it. And so what ends up happening is a lot of these texts begin to be translated from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin. And this begins to form a time period where some of these early Christian Kabbalists are combining ideas from Plato, ideas from the Hermetic world, the ideas from Hermes Trismegistus. They're beginning to combine ideas from Kabbalah, and they're beginning to form synthetic new versions of Christianity, as you can imagine, are pretty controversial. So Kabbalah becomes one of the admixtures by which a new kind of Christianity is beginning to emerge, a kind of esoteric Christianity begins to emerge in the 15th century. And some of the adopters of these are some pretty famous folks, at least in the history of mysticism or in the history of the occult. These are going to be folks like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who's a very famous 900 Theses. He challenged a pope to basically debate him about these. And basically Ficino thought that Pico had thought that he had fundamentally synthesized all knowledge, Kabbalah, Christianity, Pythagoreanism, everything. He thought he had systematized every form of knowledge into a coherent system of 900 theses, and that he basically said, I want to debate people about this, and I'll show you that I'm right. And his Kabbalistic theses are among some of the earliest examples of Christian Kabbalah, and they are at the pinnacle of the book. They come at the very, very end. They're some of the final theses in the 900 theses, and he really thinks that Kabbalah has really landed on some of these things in a way that no one else has. Francesco Giorgi is also a really early systematic incorporator of Hermetic and Kabbalistic ideas into Christianity. His works are really, really difficult to access. I don't think they've been translated to English. And they are some of the earliest examples of systematic analysis of Christianity using Kabbalah as a lens. Athanasius Kircher, of course, the famous German polymath, also integrated Kabbalah into some of his thinking. And his version of the Tree of Life, the Eitz Chaim, has gone on to basically become the standard one in the Christian occult world, or the occult world more generally, when folks who exist in places like the Golden Dawn or in Hermetic orders, often the form of the Kabbalah they're inheriting is actually traceable back to folks like Athanasius Kircher or to Johannes Reuchlin. Reuchlin also very important scholar of Hebrew, perhaps one of the greatest scholars of Hebrew in the Renaissance. And his two works, De Verbo Mirificio and De Arte Kabbalistica, are systematic presentations of both Kabbalistic ideas, but also Kabbalistic texts translated in their entirety into Hebrew. Many non-Jews whose first encounter with Kabbalah was almost certainly going to be a translation of De Arte Kabbalistica, and that or another version is another text is Kabbalah Denudata, the Kabbalah Unveiled, by Christian Norman Rosenroth. You can see a bunch of these guys are Germans. The Germans were pretty interested in this, and in fact, many people have made the argument that the Protestant Reformation has its origins in um, this kind of touch with Kabbalah. That Kabbalah is sort of the escape velocity that the Protestant Reformation at some level needs to get away from Catholicism, and that the bridge at some level away from Catholicism, the gravitational pull away from Catholicism at some level at a very early strata was Kabbalah. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Martin Luther was terribly interested in Kabbalah. He wasn't. So yeah, Luther's a whole different ball of wax. At any rate, Kabbalah Denudata is incredibly influential. Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy is probably the standard text in the Renaissance on occult philosophy and magic. Virtually all magic practitioners who operate now in the West, that is to say folks for whom magic is a part of their spiritual practice, almost certainly trace all their theory back to, at some level, to Cornelius Agrippa. So Agrippa's his 3 books of occult philosophy are foundational, and Agrippa integrates Kabbalah into his thinking seamlessly. He really is deeply connected to ideas in Kabbalah. So what I want to point out is that the Christians are also interested in Kabbalah. And I think I mentioned this maybe a couple times ago, that the first time that the Zohar was printed, it was printed in a single volume at Cremona at the behest of Christians. Christians wanted it printed. It wasn't Jews trying to get it printed. The Jewish version was printed at Mantua just about a year later in 3 volumes, which is still standard now to print the Kabbalah, to print the Zohar in 3 volumes. But the Cremona 1-volume edition was basically printed at the behest of Christians, and it's extremely rare. I think I saw one at auction a couple of years ago, and I think it went for a couple $100,000 or something. It's a very rare volume. But at any rate, just to say that Kabbalah isn't just affecting Jews, it's also deeply affecting Christians. Christians are also really interested in the development of Kabbalah, and what's going to end up happening is that will form a trajectory by which Christians will begin to interiorize a lot of Kabbalistic ideas, and that will, at some level, lay the foundation for what we sometimes call Western esotericism and the practice of the occult. So yeah, Kabbalah is wrapped up in that entire project. And I bet if you've ever seen an example of like a magical circle or something, you'll see Hebrew words written all around the periphery or whatever. A lot of it has to do with the influence of Kabbalah onto Christianity and onto Christianity's more esoteric, more occult side. Christian Kabbalah has its own life and eventually comes to become a new form of Kabbalah called Hermetic Kabbalah, which is very influential again in occult circles, primarily beginning in the 19th century. Let's go back to Safed. All right, let's go back to Safed. Safed's really the stage that we're the stage where all this is playing out. So Moshe ben Yaakov Cordovero is going to die, as all people do. And so his death in some ways signals the end of one process, one cycle of Kabbalistic development. And I will say that you can, in some sense, divide Kabbalistic history into 2 big phases. The first phase is from the early Kabbalah and Sefer Zohar all the way to Cordovero. That's one section of Kabbalah. The rest of Kabbalah can be divided into everything after that. We are all living in the shadow of what comes next. And what comes next is Isaac Luria. Luria arrived actually at Safed from Jerusalem. He was originally born in Jerusalem, although he grew up primarily in Egypt. He arrived at Safed, according to the legend at least, on the very day that Cordovero died, and allegedly he saw as the funeral train was making its way to the graveyard, which you can still go see Cordovero's tomb in Safed. I've seen it. I prayed there. You can make your way to Cordovero's tomb, and the funeral train allegedly, Isaac Luria said he saw a pillar of fire rising in front of the funeral train. Now, for folks who know some Bible, you'll recognize that image immediately, right? That's how God appeared to the Israelites during the Exodus. That God appeared to the Israelites as a pillar of fire, and so literally, Isaac Luria says that God appeared before the funeral train of Cordovero as a pillar of fire, and Luria settled in Safed. Luria's life prior to this whole couple years before he dies in Safed is actually relatively unremarkable. He is born in Jerusalem. His father dies when he's relatively young, and he's raised by his maternal uncle in Egypt. His father, his uncle, is actually relatively wealthy, pretty wealthy guy, and he provides Luria with a very high quality Jewish education. And in his 20s, Luria obtains what seems to be an early printed copy of the Zohar, maybe the Mantua, the 3-volume Mantua version, and he becomes completely infatuated with it. In fact, so infatuated that he basically goes derelict of duty. He was supposed to become a business person. He just abandons that. He had married, and he just basically abandons his wife. And he just kind of lives most of his days meditating out in a hut near the Nile. And it's during those years, those 15 or some odd years of him meditating on the Nile in this hut that he had built for himself, that he begins, it seems, to formulate the ideas that ultimately will become Lurianic Kabbalah as we know it. At some point, he has a kind of mystical breakthrough. I mean, even his birth was allegedly heralded by Elijah the prophet. I mean, there's all kinds of legends that have now grown up around Luria, that his birth, that before he was born, that Elijah the prophet appeared to his father and stuff like this. At any rate, Luria would eventually make his way back to Jerusalem, and then he would eventually make his way to Safed, arriving, as I said, on the day of Cordovero's death. And he would spend a couple of years there, just a couple of years, probably 2 or 3 years, and he died before he turned 40. This is one of these guys that, the flame that burns twice as bright only burns half as long. This guy just burned out. I mean, he was just such a titanic individual, and his ideas were just shockingly original. With Cordovero dead, and many people, I think, did believe that Cordovero was a Messiah, and when he died, it was a real big disappointment that he, died. But when Cordovero died, there was the idea that no, there's something else coming, that Cordovero is a herald. Maybe he's kind of like Elijah for the coming Messiah. And it's like Luria fit into that perfectly. Luria began to teach Kabbalah basically every day. He had introductory level Kabbalah classes. You could come to Luria's Kabbalah Academy and learn intro Kabbalah. He also began to develop a inner circle of people that he began to teach his own ideas to. And the inner circle was composed of several students. We know a good bit about those students. And what's weird is that he seems to have taught different versions of things to different students. And we know that because they say so, that some people were allowed some things and some people were allowed others, and some people got some part of the system and some people got others. And we can see this in the publications because, for instance, one of Luria's students, Israel Sarug, who doesn't really get any credit for anything and no one really pays attention to him because of Chaim Vital, but Israel Sarug was one of the earliest publishers of Chaim Vital's works, and or of Itzhak Luria's works rather, and he published them in Italy and popularized them. And so a big part of what's going on with Isaac Luria is that Luria really wants Kabbalistic ideas popularized. That's probably part of his sort of general messianic program. He believes in a very intense way that the Messiah is a hair's breadth away, and that if Kabbalah gets out there, it will usher in the Messianic age immediately. That kind of Messianic fervor is going to prove to be a disaster here in just a little bit. So we'll get back to that later. Messianic fervor is almost always going to be a disaster. At any rate, he began to build his inner core of people, and then he died. He died. He died like 2 years into being in Zafed. And so his death wasn't, he was always kind of sickly, so his death wasn't completely shocking. But after his death, his 2 most important students would be Israel Sarug, who I mentioned a moment ago, and the other, of course, the much more important student, at least historically, is going to be Chaim Vital. And it's going to be Chaim Vital's interpretation of the ideas of the Arizal, of Itzhak Luria, that are going to become definitive. The Arizal himself, Itzhak Luria, basically wrote nothing. He wrote a couple of Aramaic poems. That's all for Shabbat. That's all we have. He didn't really write much. He taught, and his students sort of synthesized the things that he taught, and it's the synthesized documents that we get. There's a long tradition of this kind of thing, right? The Buddha never wrote anything down. Jesus never wrote anything down. Muhammad couldn't read or write. There's a whole long tradition of people. Socrates famously never wrote anything. There's a whole long tradition of people who don't write things down and yet go on to change the world. So if you really want to change the world, don't write books. Writing books is a surefire way that you will not change the world. You have to be a charismatic leader and don't write anything and just talk to people. And if you talk to people and you're charismatic enough, they will do all the writing for you. And you know? And again, it's like Luria was only there in Safed for 2 or 3 years, and he managed to make this kind of decisive impact through his student Chaim Vital primarily. So, what do we know about the system of Lurianic Kabbalah? Well, I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, I'm not going to be able to systematically go through every part of it because it is incredibly difficult and baroque in its details. But the main thing to know about it is that whereas Cordovero was moving in a much more rationalistic, much more intellectualistic, much more systematic direction when it comes to trying to unpack the ideas of the Sefer Zohar, Luria is much more interested on the mythos of the Zohar. He's much more interested in the evolving process that the Zohar seems to describe about how God goes from being infinitely recessed to becoming present in the world. And so Luria's main shift is that he's going to shift away from trying to systematically analyze every aspect of how reality was constructed, but rather focus on the unfolding, the dynamic unfolding of reality and the mythology of that unfolding. And it's the mythology, and I say mythology, I don't mean falseness or like the Loch Ness monster as a myth, but it's the doing of it that really matters to him, because for Luria the entire drama of the unfolding or the evolution of reality as we know it isn't in the past, it's always present to us. And so in a way that the Cordovero might describe that the events of the unfolding of the universe via the Sephirot are events in the past, the primordial past or the metaphysical past, for Luria, time is really weird because for him, it's all happening at once. It's happened back then, it's happening now, and at some level, it's kind of happening in the future, and the future is kind of reaching for us to redeem us. And so even notions like time become very weird in the Lurianic system. So what we get is that he's primarily interested in what I might call the mythological structure, the genesis of reality and its development, as that development is comprehensible at any given moment in the development of humanity or of God. For Luria, the development of God and the development of humanity are tied together. They're the same development, basically. His system, as far as we have it, is a really highly developed system of analyzing reality. I can't say that it's always terribly coherent, and I certainly can't say that I always understand it. But what he's focused on, what his core idea is what often gets called the order of development or the order of evolution. This is often referred to as the Seder Hishtachulut, the order of evolution. In fact, the Hishtachulut is actually a standard modern Hebrew word for evolution, like Darwinian evolution. So it's the evolution of reality. Now, and again, this evolutionary model is actually instructive, right? Because at some level, biological entities contain the past within inside them. That is to say that you contain all kinds of things in your DNA from what we used to be. We're not apes like the apes before us, but we contain DNA fragments of those apes. The past is still with us. Or as Bill Faulkner said, that the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And that's true also for Lurianic Kabbalah. The idea is, yes, there were things that happened in the primeval past, the primordial past, but those things are current to us now. They're still happening. And so what we get is that there is a sort of spiraling cycle of egression. That is to say, the world is coming into being. The world is emerging as such. It's always emerging as such. And further right, it's also regressing. It's also going back to the way that it was. So there is an incredible dynamism in the Lurianic system where you kind of don't know quite where you are in time and space. You don't quite know where you are even in righteousness sometimes. There's a kind of constant movement to and fro, where the world is on the one hand becoming exiled, and on the other hand is becoming redeemed. And so the Lurianic system, part of what makes it so difficult is that at the heart of the system is this dialectical structure where everything is happening all at once and everything is also being erased all at once. And so it's very difficult to figure out at what moment something is happening, because at every moment, everything's always happening. And so knowing exactly what's going on in the system is very complicated because the system is so dynamic, and it's almost like a fractal, that the more you zoom in on a region of the fractal, the more the entire fractal is reproduced for you. And so the system is very, very fractalized like that. And so it's often difficult to know exactly what's going on in it. But let's go over some of the core ideas Itzhak Luria. The big first idea is his concept of Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum was an idea that was developed by Cordovero, actually. In fact, Cordovero was a teacher of Itzhak Luria for a brief time, I think in the 1570s, maybe. And so Cordovero had to solve a problem. The problem is, well, how do you get from an infinite God whose light reaches every metaphysical, ontological aspect of reality? God's being is infinite, and so it must occupy every point within that infinity. How do you get to an idea that there's a gap? How do you get to the idea there's a place where God isn't in order for the world to be? Because it can't be the case that if God is completely a fullness, then the system's full, and you can't have a world. You can't have the olamot. You can't have the worlds. So God has to create an emptiness, a divine emptiness, a vacuum. And what God does is God contracts some region of God's self. And I use words like region, but again, these spatial concepts are not accurate. But God ontologically contracts God's self. And that ontological contraction creates a void. And that void is both surrounded by God and yet is not God. It's a kind of gap. It's a kind of void or a vacuum. I don't know. Always imagine like when you have to like, I don't know, you gained a couple pounds and you need to get in some old pants. And so you like suck your belly in and tighten your belt real tight. It's like God sort of sucking in God's belly to get the belt on or something. I don't know how to, I always imagine that image for some reason. So God creates this void, this Tzimtzum, and into that Tzimtzum, into that void, into that contraction, that will be where the Olamot appear. The Olamot are the four worlds that comprise our reality. We do not have access to God's infiniteness. We just don't. It's just, we're finite. We do not have access to God's infiniteness. And so what we do have access to is what's left over from the process of filling that void. Now, how does that void get filled? Well, God, it's almost like a laser. God concentrates some of God's light. God finitizes some of God's light. And that finitized light, that finitized existence of God is permitted to enter into the void. And when it enters into the void, it cascades into the void. And that cascading, as it moves from the primal source of the divine into the void, it begins to weaken, so to speak. And as it begins to weaken, as it titters down into the void, as it flows down into the void, it begins to weaken. And as it weakens, there are strategic parts or the decisive parts in the weakening of the light into the void, just like if you were shining a laser, right? A laser is only going to be so powerful. It only going to reach so far. And the farther it gets, the wider it gets, and the more it begins to break down and begins to fade away. God shoots that light into the void. And this is also found in the Sefer Zohar. And as that light goes in, it begins to break down. And as it breaks down into four distinct realms. And those four distinct realms are the fundamental structures of reality. The first one is Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is the primeval body of God. It's the way that we imagine God to be. It's when you think of God as a person, what you're imagining is Adam Kadmon. It's the first primeval glimpse of God as a being. Because before that, God is just infinite light and God is utterly unimaginable. The first glimpse is Adam Kadmon. It's sort of like a negative image of God broadcast into the void. The next layer down is the realm of Atzilut, or emanation. Then down further is the world of Beriah, right, where God is becoming more and more concretized, not yet physical, but more and more concretized. And then we get to the world of formation, where God is recognizable. And then finally we get down to the world of Asiyah, and we are actually in a subsection of the world of Asiyah. And that sometimes is called the five worlds, not the four worlds, because our physical reality is distinct from all other four worlds, even the world of Asiyah. So the four worlds, the Olamot, are the ontological registers of reality. And what Luria imagines, and the reason why he imagines these four worlds, is that every single time that there is a movement within the Godhead, an evolution in the Godhead, a change in the Godhead, that change has to be understood as a logical, dialectical progression of how God is mutating, how God is changing. Because every time God interacts with something, that image of God, that aspect of God alters. And so what we get in the world of the various registers of reality is we get entirely different branches of the Sefirot. Now, I might pull this up when we get to the Q&A later, is that one thing that makes the Lurianic system so mind-bogglingly complicated is that every register of reality has its own Sephirotic structure. And inside of every Sphirot is more Sphirot. And so there are Sphirot inside of Sphirot inside of Sphirot. There are Sphirot on the backside of Guvura, which is the Sitra Achra, the world of evil. It is again, for folks who are familiar with some mathematics, it's like a fractal that anytime you zoom in on any register of reality, you begin to see that the entire system of reality is reproduced over and over and over and over again. And you have these enormously complex, what are called Ilanot or tree systems. And those really complex Ilanot or tree systems describe the various Sphirot as they're interacting with each other at these various registers of reality. We can't go into the various levels of reality because we don't have time, but each one of them is distinct, and each one of them is a moment in the development of the Godhead. Now, for some folks who have some background in philosophy, for folks who've had some background perhaps in Hegel, this is going to sound really familiar because if you ever read the logic of the progression of the logic in Hegel, Hegel actually commends Kabbalah as prefiguring his logic. Now that I'm not sure if that's an indictment of Kabbalah or not, depending on what you think of Hegel, but Hegel's system of the unfolding of reality is deeply, deeply, deeply influenced by the Lurianic sort of folding out structure of reality. Now, as God's light begins to travel through the void, what ends up happening is that the very structures that emerge to hold God's light, the very moments within the divine, as the light gets further and further and further into the void, the very structures that are meant to hold the divine light can't. They're just too far away. It's just like, I don't know, it's like it's a moment where you feel yourself, you're holding on to something right and you feel yourself just slipping off. There's a moment where you just let go. And that let go moment, the moment where the spheres, the actual vessels that hold God's light, because they've gotten so far away from the original source, they don't have enough energy, they don't have enough dynamism, they don't have enough of chizuk, they don't have enough strength to hold God's light, and they shatter. And that shattering, the shfira, the shattering of the vessels, is as it falls in, they overpower the vessels, right, and they shatter. It's like putting, folks ever seen this where you take a really cold glass vessel and pour really hot water into it, right? Or I'm sure you've seen folks, right, throw hot water on a cold windshield. That's people who don't know any better. But imagine, right, hot water being poured into an ice cold vessel. The ice cold vessel is the vacuum, the void, the simsum. And when you pour the lightning hot rays of God into it, the vessels just shatter. And that shattering forms what are called klipot, shards. And these shards of the vessels, these shards are characterized by disharmony and disunity. They're broken aspects of the divine. They're aspects of the divine that are localized, just like if you'd imagine taking a part of your own personality and breaking it off from you. So just imagine your curiosity, right? If you took pure curiosity, which is a pretty good trait, and broke it off and made it its own thing, pure curiosity is a disaster. Because anything that's purely curious is going to get self-killed. It's going to hurt people. It's not going to have any ethics. It'll just experiment on people. Right? Even love, right? Pure love, if you take it away and put it with no checks at all, it's too much. Any aspect of the divine broken away from the divine and then given its own reality will always be too much, no matter what it is, whether it's God's wrath or God's goodness, whether it's God's curiosity or whatever. None of these things can exist on their own. And the shards of these vessels, according to Luria, become evil. Now, they're not inherently evil, but because they're localized, intense versions of the divine, they shouldn't be allowed to exist on their own. And because they shouldn't be allowed to exist on their own, they go haywire. And these become evil in the Lurianic system. This is the origin of evil. The demons of the world are the klipot, the shards of the vessels that once held God's light, because they're just out of control. They're completely disunited, completely unharmonious. And so they're sort of like extreme versions of God. And so these demonic aspects of the demonic aspects of the Lurianic system are these klipot, and they are the object of a process called tikkun. And I bet you're already beginning to hear, right, where we're going to get to next, right, the idea of tikkun olam. Well, we are right at the very end of that system. The entire giant system of God's simsum and God pouring God's light in, and the entire process of the shattering of the vessels, we are at the very limit of that system. And so at the very limit of that system, right, it's like a rubber band, right? As you stretch a rubber band out and let it go, it flies all the way this way and then it flies back. We are at the very end, the receiving end of all of the divine system, and we are at the very bottom of the system, and we are the part of the system that begins to move back up, right? We are the system, we are part of that, we can move things back up. And what happens is that we recognize, Lurianic Kabbalists recognize, that the shards of the divine, the klipot, can be rectified by engaging in the magic of the Torah. Again, Itzhak Luria is not sort of a hippy dippy mystic. He says, no, you repair the world, you metaphysically repair the world by engaging in the metaphysical act of engaging in following God's law. Because the divine law, the Torah is the system, it's like the source code of all reality. And if you follow it and if you do it correctly, it fixes reality. Reality is broken at some level. And so the fix is, according to Itzhak Luria, the very strict following of the Jewish law, of the halakha, and of the Torah. So by following the Torah, you repair reality. And this is where the phrase tikkun olam comes from. You are repairing the world. Now, I know that most folks hear the word tikkun olam and we think something like helping people who are, I don't know, giving to charity or something like that. But for Itzhak Luria, it's not just a fixing the world in terms of the social ills or doing social justice stuff. That's, of course, part of it too. But by having the right kavanah, by having the right concentration, by having the right intention, by doing the Jewish law with absolute intention, with purity of heart, by performing things like Shabbat, by putting tefillin on, by observing the fast of Yom Kippur or whatever, all these things help to repair reality. They fix reality at the metaphysical level. They give reality a tikkun. And further, you begin to build the world of the Messiah. Because in the Lurianic system, the act of reparation, the act of repairing the world, begins to sort of build the world in which the Messiah can emerge. And at some level, you can imagine the Messiah as kind of the keystone of the entire process. The Messiah is the person who will turn the key. We will build the world worthy of Messiah, and Messiah will come and turn the key, and they will unfurl the final redemption. And so it's by repairing the world that we prepare the world for the possibility of Messiah. And this idea is going to have enormous impact in the history of Judaism. If you ever hung out with folks in the Chabad Lubavitch movement, I don't know if folks have ever been around Chabad people who, can you light candles? Can you put on tefillin? You can, be walking around New York and I'll have a Chabad guy, I'll stop me in the street and be like, hey, you put tefillin on today? And I'm like, no. He's like, well, can you put tefillin on now? Why would they bother you on the street to put tefillin on? It's not because they're trying to do you a favor. They're trying to engage in tikkun olam. They think that every Jew, male Jew, whatever that means to them, who can engage in the process of tikkun olam and who can put tefillin on will usher in the days of the Messiah that much more quickly. And so they're trying at some level to accelerate, right? One can think about Kabbalistic ideas or the Lurianic Kabbalah as a kind of Jewish accelerationism. The world is broken and they're trying to accelerate the process by which it's repaired. And you accelerate that process by engaging in spiritual warfare against the klipot and by binding and then repairing the klipot in a way that allows you to basically accelerate the process by which the Messiah comes. And if you read Chaim Vital, he really does think that he definitely thinks he's the Messiah. He just thinks that he has to be a little bit more righteous. If he can just be a little bit more, if he just didn't think about that woman, right, when he was praying, if he just didn't think that dirty thought, if he just memorized a little bit more Mishnah, then he would have been revealed as the Messiah. He would have emerged as the Messiah. This is an idea you see him constantly in his journals. Chaim Vital simultaneously manages to be both incredibly self-deprecating and also incredibly arrogant. I guess that tends to go hand in hand. But sometimes he's, I'm unworthy of anything. I'm the lowest of the low. And then sometimes like, yeah, if I'd have just done this, I'd have been the Messiah. So the idea is that the Messiah is right around the corner, and it's the result of this process of tikkun olam. Now, of course, that idea has gotten retrofitted in sort of liberal Jewish circles for social justice, but in the classical Kabbalistic world, it has everything to do with strict obedience to the Torah. Another key innovation in the Lurianic system is that Luria is really obsessed with some of the more bizarre sections of the Zohar. There are three sections of the Zohar that are notoriously difficult to understand. Two of them are the Idrot, the assemblies, and the final is a section called Sifra Ditzniuta. And Sifra Ditzniuta is a relatively brief section of the Zohar that contains a long description of God's beard. And then there's another section that also contains descriptions of God's beard, but also God's face in general. And no one's really sure what in the world's going on in those sections. They're really, really weird. Weird even compared to other sections of Zohar. Zohar is weird enough, but it's like weird on weird. And it's like Luria develops a systematization of this idea of the movements within the divine face, that the divine face is actually reflective of metaphysical changes in reality, and that the divine face are the countenances of the partsufim, that these partsufim are arrangements of the sphirot, and those arrangements of the sphirot are indicators of certain kinds of changes or developments within the divine. I will go ahead and say this: the partsufim is without a doubt the most complicated part of the entire structure of Lurianic Kabbalah, because it's analyzing the sphirot in terms of how they're arranged and how the various system relates to itself internally, and it is just completely difficult to understand. I still struggle trying to figure out, like, I know what the various configurations are. I know, Ima and the Erech Apayim or whatever. Like, I know what the structures look like, but when you begin to analyze how they move and change in relationship to other mystical stuff going on in the Arizal system, it just becomes a maze. It just becomes a maze. So I have a real difficult time keeping track of what's going on in this sort of inner development of the Godhead. But what's important to note is that for Luria, God is not a thing. God is a process, and God is changing all the time. And so when God tells to Moshe Rabbeinu, right, Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah, I'll be what I'll be. Luria takes that really seriously. Yeah, God is changing. God is a process. God is not a thing. God is a process, and that process is a reality, and we are part of that process. And just like you get angry, so does God. And just like you get, compassionate, so does God. And that the change of God from angry to compassion, or the change from a normal state of affairs to being angry, that change in your emotions can be mapped. And so ditto with God, a change in God's emotional life can be mapped. And those mappings of God's emotional psychology or intellectual psychology are the partsufim. This is very complicated. It's part of the inner psychology, the inner divine psychology. It's really complicated stuff. Also, famously, it's like Luria is going to reintroduce the concept of reincarnation into Judaism. Reincarnation is an idea that never really took hold in most of the Abrahamic faiths, although there are tiny groups of people who seem to have believed in it at some point. But most of the larger Abrahamic faiths have rejected reincarnation for various kinds of reasons. However, in Lurianic Kabbalah, reincarnation is completely acceptable. In fact, it's part of the system. In fact, if you just want to, sort of a general idea, this is Chaim Vital's major work, Eitz Chaim. This is the most systematic account of Isaac Luria's philosophy. So this is the major work of Isaac Luria's philosophy as articulated by Chaim Vital. And this is the standard now 2-volume text on reincarnation by Chaim Vital. This is the teachings of Yitzhak Luria on reincarnation. This is the Sha'arei HaGilgalim, the gates of reincarnation. So reincarnation is an idea that is reintroduced into Judaism. It may have existed earlier in some ways, but certainly Chaim Vital really introduces it via Yitzhak Luria. And the idea is that every single person has what they call a soul root. And the soul root is a kind of aspect of your soul. There are 5 different layers of your soul according to the Lurianic system. And some of those parts of your soul go all the way back to the beginning of all creation. And various people have had that soul. You are like, a root. You are a root, and there are things growing off the root, and you're one of the things growing off the root. And there have been many, many, many people prior to you that have had the same soul as you. Now, the bad thing about that is they've committed all kinds of sins that you're now responsible for fixing. Because again, remember, Luria's system is dynamic. Just because you engage in tikkun once doesn't mean that you didn't do bad stuff before. And if you did bad stuff, well, if you break the Jewish law, that further damages reality. And so there have been people in the past that have really damaged reality. Maybe in your past life, you were someone really bad. Chaim Vital, by the way, his soul root was Cain, the first murderer. And so, as you can imagine, Chaim Vital, whose soul root was Cain, had a lot to fix because he was the literal origin of murder in the world. And so he had to undergo all kinds of what are called tikkunim, these reparations. And these reparations include everything from ascetic practices to reading certain parts of the Bible to engaging in mystical practices and things like this. And so the idea is that not only are you responsible for you being a good you have to make up for all the things that have happened prior to you. So every person that's had your soul prior to you, you are now responsible for figuring out how to fix all the bad things they did, because all the bad things are still there. You're most apt to fix them. Now, how do you figure that out? You go to a mystic, a Kabbalist, and then a Kabbalist will tell you who your soul root is, and they will tell you all the bad things that you've done, and they will give you tikkunim and how to fix them. And the tikkunim can be anything from extra prayers to amulets to fasting. There are all kinds of tikkunim that one can have. If you ever go to Sfat, if you ever go to Safed to this day, you can go to Kabbalists. I've seen signs in Safed where they will go and they will figure out who your soul root is. And they're alleged experts who know how to do this. I don't know how they know how to do this, but I'll give it to them. That's fine. And they can figure out who your soul root is, and they will tell you that your soul root was Lamech, and they committed this sins, and you were inherited these sins, and these are the kind of tikkunim that you need to do, reparation you need to do to fix the sins of your past lives. Reincarnation has entered into Judaism completely intact, and it is a completely viable way of thinking about your afterlife. It is not heterodox at all. It's very normative at this point. And so reincarnation with the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah is now basically normalized in a way that I don't think it is in Christianity and Islam. I think in Christianity and Islam, if you want to believe in reincarnation, you don't want to make a big deal of it. I think if you make a big deal of it, if you're a Catholic, whatever, you're going to get in trouble. Whereas in Judaism, reincarnation is completely normalized. Now, I say it's normalized, but it's only normalized within the system of Lurianic Kabbalah, where you would, if you want to find out who your reincarnation's of, you need to do the work of fixing all the sins they committed. And you may be shocked to learn all the bad things that you did in your past life. Now, you do also earn the merit of your past life, but you also earn all the bad stuff too. This idea that the soul can survive death, then can be reborn. Also, it means that various other regions of the soul, again, you have 5 regions of your soul. Some other regions of your soul can actually survive death and become detached from the other regions. And those detached parts of your soul, if you committed a lot of sins in your life, they become addicted to those sins. And that aspect of your soul that becomes addicted to those sins actually can roam around and want to continue committing sins in the next life. This is especially true of sexual sin. But also gluttony and drunkenness and stuff. And so if you were a lecherous, drunken, bad person, then if you become addicted to those things when you die, your soul will become so polluted that it will become detached from your other souls, and it will roam around. And what does it want to do? It wants to continue doing what it did, getting drunk and having sex or whatever. And so what it will do is it will try to attach itself to other people, because you can't really get drunk and have sex if you're just a soul. So you got to get attached to someone else. And so when your soul attaches, your evil soul attaches itself to other people, the word for to attach in Hebrew is dabak, right? In fact, the modern Hebrew word for glue comes from the same root word. Your soul dabak, it clings to other people, and that soul that clings to other people, that possesses them, this is the origin of the dibik. The dibik is the evil version of your soul. It's the evil aspect of your soul that roams around and tries to attach itself to other people. And the very earliest exorcism stories that we have in Judaism are actually from Safed. I've actually taught a whole class on spirit possession in Judaism. And if you want to learn more about this, I have some episodes on my YouTube channel as well. But what you have here is demonic possession. Demonic possession is not the right word, because it's not demon. It's actually an evil, dead person doing the possessing. And so dibukim become a big deal in the Kabbalistic world as well. But the opposite's true too. The soul of very righteous people hangs around near their grave. And if you need to get some spiritual chizuk, if you need some righteousness, let's say that you're traveling somewhere and you know that, your old paramour is going to be there and you don't want to like hook up with them. This is a real example, by the way, because you don't want to hook up with them because you're married or whatever. And you don't want to commit adultery because that's bad. So what do? You go into the graveyard of a righteous person, and you lay on the graveyard, you lay on the grave of the righteous person, and you meditate on their soul, and you invite their soul into your soul, and they will impregnate you. This is called ibur, and the soul of the righteous dead person will impregnate your soul with a little bit of their righteousness, and it will give you enough of a chizuk, enough of righteousness, that when you go to face this spiritual challenge of committing adultery, you won't do it, because it's like a shot in the arm, a shot in the soul from the righteous person, and the righteous person will give you the spiritual power to overcome your failure, your whatever, your sin, and then they will come back to their grave and they'll help other people. And if for folks who know a little bit about Buddhism, right, this sounds a bit like bodhisattvas, right? The idea that there are people who are enlightened in the Buddhist tradition, that they become so enlightened that they don't become completely enlightened, so they can stick around here to help the rest of us schmucks, right? These are bodhisattvas. They don't leave, they don't go to nirvana, but they stay here to help the rest of us get a little bit more enlightened. And so these tzaddakim, these tzedukim, these righteous people, you can go lay on their graves, and you can get a little bit of spiritual power from their soul, and it'll go into your soul and help you. People do this to this day. People do this. It's a problem, actually, that people get caught sneaking into graveyards and lying on graves to get soul power. Soul power sounds like a cool 70s band. So at any rate, so this idea of ibur becomes a big idea as well. So dibuk, right, is evil souls becoming attached to your body. They can also get in animals, by the way. They don't like to be in animals because apparently it's like not good in there, but they want to get into people. And Chaim Vital, by the way, also became one of the earliest exorcists in this whole tradition. And by the way, he failed. He also could get the dibuk to leave, and then as soon as the dibuk left, it will come back and repossess the person and kill them. And so there's all kinds of great Dybbuk stories. If you've never seen the movie The Dybbuk, it's one of the great classics of Yiddish film. It was filmed in the 30s. In fact, many of the people that were in the film died in the Holocaust. And so it's really, I think they remastered it and they've redone the Yiddish subtitles. And if you've ever seen The Dybbuk, it's a great film from the 30s. It's a classic example of Yiddish theater and eventually Yiddish filmmaking. Probably the crowning achievement before it all went to hell because of the Holocaust. But The Dybbuk is a classic movie. For we're getting close to Halloween time. If you want some Jewish Halloween movie watching, watch The Dybbuk. So the Dybbuk is an idea that emerges also from Lurianic Kabbalah, but also ibur. As I said a minute ago, Lurianic Kabbalah becomes just Kabbalah. If you've ever studied Kabbalah, you've heard this term Zimtzum, Tikkun Olam, right? You've heard of the world of Atzilut and Beria and the world of Asiya. You know that the soul has, that there's a Yechida and a Neshama and a Ruach and all the various parts of the soul. Lurianic Kabbalah just became Kabbalah. It absorbed all other previous forms of Kabbalah, whether it's Abraham Abulafia's Kabbalah, whether it was Cordovero's Kabbalah, whether it was other forms of Kabbalah. It absorbed them all, and in some ways transcended them all. It abolished them all, and it ascended above them all. And by both eliminating all of them and then conglomerating all of them into one thing, it became a new thing. And that new thing basically has become Jewish theology. If you've ever read books of Jewish theology, modern books of Jewish theology, they are almost always derivative of Itzhak Luria's Kabbalah. And that's true of Hasidic people. That's true of Misnag people, the opponents of the Hasidic people. That's true of hardcore Jewish rationalists, people like what's a good example? The Vilna Gaon, right? The hardcore rational guy, also hardcore Kabbalist. Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah, is at some level just Jewish theology now. Now, what's ironic about that, and we'll talk about this more as we wrap the class up in a few weeks, why aren't these texts available then? If at some level, Tikkun Olam and all these ideas are just basically now part of our theological landscape in Judaism, why isn't it that you just can't go buy a copy of Eitz Chaim in English? Why isn't you can't just go buy a copy of Cordovero's Pardes Ramim in English? Why is it that the entire 15-volume Kitvei Ha'ari, the collected works of the Ari, are not translated in English? There's a reason for that. And we'll get to that in a few weeks, because there is a really important reason for why that is. It has everything to do with liberal Judaism and how liberal Judaism decanonized Kabbalah. It rejected Kabbalah. And that's part of what made liberal modern Judaism is the amputation of Kabbalah from Judaism. Now that's changing, but it's not changing in the right way, because the way that it's changing is not that it's changing in the sense that Kabbalistic ideas are being imported. They're being imported haphazardly, and the original texts are not being consulted, and they're not being really translated. And so modern Jews who are interested in Kabbalah don't have access to the original texts. And that's a disaster. That's a real disaster. I mean, it would be, can you imagine if, I don't know, if the works of Thomas Aquinas just weren't translated to English? You would have to rely on old Latin editions and stuff like that. It would be a mess. Well, that's what basically we have. It's as if Thomas Aquinas had the influence he did in the Catholic world, but no Catholics have access to his actual works in English. A reliable, translation. It's a mess. It's a real mess. So, and again, like this is a standard volume of Eitz Chaim in Hebrew. You will not. There's no English translation. There's no translation. We'll talk about why in a few weeks, but there's just not one, and it's a mess. It's a bad situation. So, at the end of the day, Itzhak Luria's version of Kabbalah wins. It wins. Now, I'm not saying it's completely systematic, and I'm not saying it's completely all worked out. There's still a bunch of kinks in the system. But at the end of the day, the 15-volume collected works of the Arizal, really the works of Chaim Vital, who is systematizing the works at some level of the Arizal, that becomes Jewish theology. Now, on the one hand, that's really cool because Kabbalah won. On the other hand, it's a disaster because most Jews who are interested in Kabbalah, at least in the non-Orthodox world, have no access to them. It's a mess. This is a real problem, and I don't know how it's going to get solved. But I mean, it's just now in the past 10 years that the entire Zohar has been translated reliably into English. So this is a big problem. We'll talk about this problem. We'll talk about why we're in this boat and how we're going to get out of it in a few weeks. But it may just, in our lifetime, we may be getting out of that problem. It may take our entire lifetime to get out of this problem. So we'll talk about where it came from, why it is that way, and how we're going to get out of it, because I think we will. 6 years after Chaim Vital dies, the greatest articulator of the Lurianic system of Kabbalah, 6 years after he dies, a guy is born in Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey, in Izmir. He's born on he's born on Tish B'Av. He's born on Tish B'Av, which happens to fall on a Shabbat that year. And there's a long-standing idea in Jewish lore that the Messiah will be born on the saddest day of the year. That the day of the year that we mourn every bad thing that's ever happened to us. That the great hope is that on that day, Messiah will be born. That in the future, the Tish B'Av will no longer be a sad day. It'll be a glorious day because that'll be the birthday to the Messiah. On Saturday of Tish B'Av, 6 years after the death of Chaim Vital, Shabbatai Tzvi is born. And Shabbatai Tzvi is going to transform Kabbalah because he's going to become the Messiah. And not just become the Messiah. When I say that, I mean the majority of the world's Jews were convinced he was the Messiah. And he convinced the world's Jews that he was the Messiah via his publicist, Nathan of Gaza, using Kabbalah. And he will become enormously influential. In fact, in many ways, you can think about Judaism as a religion, in some ways, as before Shabbatai Tzvi and then after him. And Shabbatai Tzvi is going to transform Judaism. He's going to transform so much of what's going to happen in Judaism. And so what we're going to do is that he's going to basically shake Judaism to its core. Because as you probably know, he will declare himself the Messiah. The vast majority of Jews will believe that he's the Messiah. Many of them literally had their bags packed on the docks in Amsterdam, ready to go back home to Israel to live in the Messianic age. And in 1666, he converts to Islam. And it is a titanic disaster. A disaster. Prior to the Holocaust, there's been no greater disaster than the Shabbatai Tzvi episode. No greater disaster. And from a theological point of view, it's a disaster. So in many ways, right, you can think about Shabbatai Tzvi as the fulcrum. And I imagine most folks here have heard the idea that you can't study Kabbalah until you're 40. Right, folks, I'm sure folks have heard that idea. Well, notice that Itzhak Luria died before he was 40. Clearly, he was studying Kabbalah before he was 40. Where do ideas like that come from? They come in the aftermath of Shabbatai Tzvi. Because the idea is that Kabbalah is so dangerous they can lead the entire Jewish world into a disaster. And that disaster, a Kabbalistic disaster, will be heralded by Shabbatai Tzvi, the false Messiah. We will turn to him and his arguments for his messiahhood next time. So Shabbatai Tzvi, and also Frankism. Frankism is a derivative of Shabbatai Tzvi. So we'll turn our attention to Shabbatai Tzvi and what is sometimes referred to as mystical heresy. Is Kabbalah gone off the rails? Totally off the rails. So we will deal with Shabbatai Tzvi and his so-called messianism next week. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work of providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, along with magic and Hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.